China's development has amazed the world during 40 years of reform and opening up. But questions remain whether China's road is unique or replicable. How Chinese is China today? And is it a follower or leader in world technology? China is connecting with the world through its Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to be more inclusive and build a shared future. Is this ambitious plan seen as an opportunity or a threat by other countries? What should be made of debt trap allegations? Will foreign investment get more access to the Chinese market? For more discussion, tune in for Dialogue's special programs.
The path of development is never a smooth one that leads directly to prosperity. Fortunately, China has made remarkable progress in its economic reform and opening. But there have been challenges at every step, bumps and detours and even dead ends along the way. Criticism and doubt from the West are also commonplace. So what did China get right in the economic and social development? And in what areas does China need further reform and opening? To continue our discussion and search for answers, I'm here with Rick Dunham, visiting scholar from Tsinghua University, Charles Liu, founder of How Capital, Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined, and Victor Gao Zhikai, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. That's the dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Due to two landmark events, China became more open. First, a few years ago, on January the 1st, the most consequential bilateral relationship was normalized between Washington and Beijing during the Carter administration. The second, our entry into the WTO in the year 2001. In both cases, China's openness and transparency have been raised to a new level. The issue is why President Xi Jinping and the whole economy of China have been urged to lower the tariffs and to provide them overseas multinationals unprecedented access to the Chinese market. Does it mean China is not open enough? Hannah.
This is a wonderful, exciting market to be part of, and many countries would love to be part of it. And they do want a stronger partnership with China on that level. And it's great that there is this, in a sense, this new debate that this is going to be, that this is happening, that there'll be even more opening up and reform of the Chinese economy going forward.
China is not perfect. Does it mean that we have a lot more to be done to open ourselves up, to satisfy the rest of the world, which is very demanding?
Yeah, I think the real issue is that China just developed too fast. Because 30 years ago, people came to China because of cheap manufacturing. 15 years ago, it started to see, oh my God, it's becoming a market. And 5 years ago, it's becoming a huge market with 400 million middle-class consumers, 130 million who travel abroad and consume abroad.
800 million being lifted out of poverty.
Exactly. So what happened is that the multinationals, and I think others who want to sell, including the poorer countries that want to sell to China, 10, 15 years ago wouldn't think about it. But today, there is this opportunity. So I think it just happened so quickly over the last 2 decades, really, or the decade and a half, that China's entire structure, economic structure, is not yet suited to accommodate that more freer flow of goods. It was protecting its infant industries, it was protecting its national champions, it was, which is something that everybody accepted 2 decades ago.
I have a different opinion, yes. First, I disagree somewhat with the premise of your question, which was that 2001 WTO led to opening up and transparency. It led to a lot of opening up, but I don't think it led to much more transparency. I think there's a lot that's opaque in China in government and business. And I do think there are legitimate issues as China becomes a global power. We don't argue that anymore, that China is an economic global power. Does China have to play by the same rules that it plays by when it invests in the United States or Japan or Germany? And that is a legitimate point to debate. There are so many barriers on global investment in China that don't exist in the other countries for Chinese firms. And secondly, I saw the reaction in America to Xi Jinping's latest speech where he is talking about how we're going to open up China. And commentators quoted him in 2012 almost the exact same words. Right now, there is pushback in the West saying, we don't want words, we want actions. The promises aren't enough anymore. We actually want to see opening up in the financial sector or in other sectors.
Okay, no more lip service, action for action. That's what is demanded in the ongoing negotiations between the two sides about whether compromise will be made eventually to avert a trade war. Victor, now the issue is whether China is still regarded as a developing country. That is a very important issue for the future of WTO, whether it be allowed to exist. President Trump says allowing China to enter into the WTO is a serious mistake that the United States has made. The critical issue about the future of WTO is whether China will continue to be regarded as a developing country. Most in the world would say no, China is no longer a developing country. But that has a lot to do with the preferential policies, including subsidies for the Chinese economy and some sectors of the Chinese economy. What do you make of these concerns?
Yes, indeed. Before I answer your question, let me briefly answer your question about China's openness. I think China needs to continue to open up, and the degree of openness of China need to catch up with the rapid changes that we have mentioned that's taking place in China. So I think we need to view the more and greater openness of China as something good for China. It's not just something good for, let's say, African countries or America or Japan, for example, European countries. It's good for China, good for the Chinese people, as well as good for all the participating countries in the opening up of China. Now, you talked about your question,
the future of the WTO and whether China will remain a developing country in the eyes of the rest of the world.
When President Trump says it's a big mistake that the United States made to allow China to become a member of WTO, I think it's pure fantasy. I think any country which qualified to become a member of WTO could become a member of WTO. And the United States, of course, did not stand in the way under the Clinton administration.
But how do you respond to Rick's concerns about the difference between opening up and transparency?
I think opening up and transparency are both important for China to do. I think China needs to open up, of course, and to become more transparent. And it's transparent to ourselves as well as to foreign observers and foreign participants. Sometimes, for example, purely from the American or Japanese or European, African perspectives, they find it very difficult to get a handle on what's going on in China. Even for people like me who spend 24 hours a day in China, sometimes the changes are so quick that I find it baffling for me because I'm left behind by the rapid changes. So I think we do not need to play a blame game. We need to really spend more time on the Chinese side to open up and become more transparent, but for the international friends, they also need to do their homework to really understand the rapid changes in China. I think China joining the WTO is good for China and good for the whole world.
There's no reason to argue this again, but Victor, let me go back to what you said in the first chapter of our discussion on privacy. You said privacy is a relative issue, is a conditional. What do you think of the issue of transparency? Is that still also conditional, relative concept? Do you defend your position that everything's relative?
Now, first of all, I think privacy is definitely relative. It varies greatly from one country to another. Accountability or transparency is also relative, but it's to a much lesser extent. I think, especially in the business community, there is a higher degree of convergence about transparency or accountability, and I think we have a much clearly defined international standards for transparency in doing business across national boundaries.
For example, if you want to get a company listed in the stock market, you have to give a release of full details.
Absolutely.
Seriously flawed details will mean being bankruptcy or sued in the class action. What do you think?
I think we have to go back to what was the point of the WTO in the first place, and especially for poorer countries, the what they were trying to get and what they're still trying to get from the WTO is support for improving trade around the world through, in particular, by cutting tariffs, cutting subsidies. And if there is a lack of transparency, then it makes it even difficult for them to understand what those subsidies are and put the pressure on. Now, because China is such a big market now, as you were mentioning, this has become a big issue. And so we need to be thinking from their perspective, what do they need? That's the point of the UN, in many ways, to advocate, organizations like the WTO, to be advocating for the poorest in the world because they don't have a chance. So if we can think about from their perspective, what do they want from China in terms of reducing subsidies? They also want the subsidies reduced in the US on agriculture, for example.
Or Europe.
And in Europe too. Huge agricultural subsidies. These are still very live, very important issues. And I think the richer countries have a role. China has a role in making sure all of those are addressed at the same time.
In different industry, perhaps, the degree of transparency would have a shades of difference. Is that your concern?
Well, I think the biggest concern there is the biggest concern from the Western countries, or the complaint, is how SOEs get subsidized by the central government. You know, when the People's Bank says, okay, release of new funds, another 500 billion, you know, where does it go? It goes to state-owned financial institutions and SOEs and so on and so forth. That's really what they're addressing. I think to generalize it as lack of transparency is not fair, because in many markets, that is private sector development.
Look, may I have your attention? The issue eventually, by the end of the day, is on whose terms games would be played or rules would be worked out. On the American terms, whatever China says, people like Peter Navarro, John Bolton, like Tyson say it's too late. You have to 100% comply with our terms, otherwise the trade war will continue anyway. The Chinese side will say, let's do it step by step, very much like the process of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. It's a process. But the United States only gave you 3 months for the truth. So what do you think of the pace and agenda of trade protectionism? On which side's terms should the game be conducted? Rick?
Well, let me start by saying I have a difficult time thinking Donald Trump speaks for the United States. He's president, yes. He has the power. He can say 3 months. I think every other president, both parties, believed in the idea of a process. And I think global trade works best for everyone when there are rules that are understood, when there's a system, if you have a grievance, to go through the system, where you continue making progress to break down barriers, whether it's American sugar or access to certain parts of the Chinese market or intellectual property. I mean, Donald Trump just throws a bomb, either a stick bomb or a real bomb into the
Or is it the
system.
fake news? I don't know.
Well, no, he will call it fake news if we are critical of him. That's a road I don't want to go down right now because it gets away from our subject, which really I think is important. The idea that the whole global economy can grow as long as we have a rules-based system. And countries can have legitimate complaints about other countries, but you have to solve it. So back to Donald Trump for just a moment here. I mean, Donald Trump is president, and he does have power to do a lot of damage to the global economy now. This trade war has no winners. I mean, U.S. economy, Chinese economy is hurt more in the short term, but Donald Trump has hurt the U.S. economy for years into the future with what's happened now when the impact is felt. So I think if there's a way that the globe can contain the damage from Donald Trump for the next couple of years and then hope that we return to a more normal discussion with legitimate differences, but at least a discussion.
Victor, a couple of points. First of all, I hope President Donald Trump and his administration will realize that trade war or tariffs are bad. It's bad for China, of course, but it's also bad for the United States. In the longer term, U.S. will lose more, as I agree with you, from the trade war and
but
the
they don't care.
They will care eventually. If the situation between China and the United States continues like this, into the first half of next year, then major financial crisis may happen. It's not just happening in China, it may involve the United States in a very big way. That's number one. Number two is that I think between China and the United States, some people in Washington say complete disengagement from China. The United States, since the end of the 19th century, have always been calling for the open door policy for China. They see and they know the importance of the Chinese market, and now the Chinese market is already the largest
therefore the United States used the indemnity to bring Chinese students to the other side of the Pacific Ocean for education and for industrialization later on in mainland China. The establishment of the first university, the establishment of the first hospital were all made possible with the help of the U.S. humanitarian assistance, right?
Absolutely. So allow me to finish. So I think access to the Chinese market is very, very important to America, to the American people, as well as the American industries. Imagine what President Donald Trump is preaching about will become successful. More manufacturing capacities will move back to the United States. Let's assume that will happen. Then what? Then the American manufacturing capacities will need market to sell their products to. So don't discount the Chinese market. Always have faith in the Chinese market. Have access and better access to the Chinese market. I think this is my advice to President Donald Trump.
In terms of that, as you described, everything is a process, and it's important to see it as a process. Take the financial services sector. Okay. I've been in the sector for a long time, and I can say the way the Wall Street guys play this game, it is cutthroat, and they don't care what happens to the country in which they play. We've seen this in 1998 with the Asian financial crisis, destroying the economies of Indonesia and Thailand and others, and attempted to destroy the economy of Hong Kong and Malaysia. Now, China's financial system is only recently built over the last decade. It's not sophisticated enough and mature enough and strong enough to withstand the plays of the hedge funds and the highly leveraged plays that we see Wall Street machine trading, for example, can do. So I think it has to be accepted that the opening up of different sectors of the economy requires different time horizon and different process. The opening up, if you talk about convertibility of the RMB, if you convert the RMB, become freely converting, it would be so destructive to the Chinese economy because it simply is not built to withstand such external shock, at least for another decade.
Therefore, whether we should follow the terms of the U.S. or we follow our own agenda, I mean, this is a roadmap of China's development. This has a lot to do with leadership. That's the subject matter that we discussed in the first chapter. Victor.
Now, I think some people in the United States tend to believe that they have a monopoly of truth. In reality, they don't. No one has a monopoly of truth. Different people, different countries, different governments can learn from each other. If you have a better version of truth, I can learn from you. But you never have a monopoly of truth. Anyone who believes, or even, for example, in the case of the United States, if the United States believes it has a monopoly of truth, it's falling down from the grace. So I think from the Chinese perspective, we need to differentiate. If the United States has a better version of truth, we can learn from the United States. If they don't have a better version of truth, we need to learn from other countries, or we need to come up with our own version of truth. But we cannot convince ourselves that one day we may have a monopoly of truth.
Excuse me, Victor, the issue is you don't have a choice. This is what is going on in the China bashing crusade against the second biggest economy. They are wielding and brandishing the big stick, and they say, you follow my terms or you are my enemy.
I think if anyone in China will kowtow to such China bashing, he will be out of the government. That's for sure. The Chinese people will not allow that
Rick,
to happen.
How do you look at the explanation by Victor about the so-called post-truth world, post-order world? Or we have the possibility of alternative truths other than listening to the United States.
Well, that's true. right? In the post-truth world, what you said is true. I mean, no one country should dictate terms to the world. There are leaders, but to me, usually leaders are people or countries who don't keep saying, I'm the leader, I'm the leader, I'm the leader, you should follow me because I'm the leader. And there's, I mean, in a lot of cases, there is something is true or false. But wisdom or the right decision is something that you debate. I mean, this is where my training as a historian comes in. You learn lessons from other cultures, from things that have happened in your own culture, and then you make smart decisions going forward. That, to me, is the process. China doesn't have to say, we will follow the American model, or the British model, or the Russian model. China is Chinese, to go back to where we started the discussion, and China has to synthesize all of this to develop a system going forward, economic and business, that is in the interest of China. And for the Chinese government, I mean, the slogan of the Chinese government is win-win cooperation. So if you follow that slogan, it is developing an economic system that's good for China, but that helps other countries.
Here is the catch-22 situation, Rick. Your colleague, Professor Alison Graham from Harvard University, put forward the idea of a Thucydides trap, which means, in the contemporary terms, if one economy accounts for over 60% of the U.S. total, then it means trade war. China is 63% of the U.S. GDP, and that means a war is looming larger on the horizon.
Yeah, I think your point is valid to say there's more of a likelihood of trade conflict. I don't think it necessarily must be. It really depends on the two nations involved.
But given the rise of populism, trade protectionism, as well as the alleged process of de-globalization, if you look at protests every time, without exceptions, outside the venue of the major conference on climate change or globalization.
But you're really talking about Europe and the United States. I want to draw a really serious distinction here. What has made the world much more prosperous in the last 2 decades is the rise of Asia. China is the magnet and the core of this new supply chain, without which you would not have what is the most modern supply chain, logistics, most productive, the highest efficiency and lowest cost supply chain, which can now send cell phones to Africa at $35, which can send smartphones to India at $45. That Asia rising is the core issue. It's not China and the United States. It's the U.S. trying to dismantle this major new Asia rising supply chain. Before, it was Japan in the 1980s with the Plaza Accord. It was Japan plus the 4 little tigers, or 4 little dragons, however you may call them. But that was only 1/10 of Asia in terms of population, market size, and so on. Today, it's no longer that. We're talking about continued Asia contributing over 50% to global growth in terms of net growth in the world, or nearly 60% to global growth.
I'm afraid, Charles, you have underestimated the adversity of the situation of serious geopolitical and economic competitions between the two biggest economies. Most members of the ASEAN organization have been urged quietly by the United States to take side, to make decision and take side either with the United States or China. Fortunately, it's another case with President Bush after 9/11. You either take side with us or you'll be our enemy. The issue is, let's look at China's investment in Africa or in other developing countries. The transparency about the debt trap. You might call it a conspiracy theory that was built up deliberately by Western media to demonize the image of China's business and presence in Africa or in other developing countries. However, you said once upon a time on our show, we welcome the debt, right? Yes. Can you elaborate a little bit? The Americans would find it very difficult to be convinced.
Let me just interrupt you. I have to interrupt you on that. A central banker from an ASEAN country said, I'd much rather take the debt from the Chinese government than from Wall Street bankers because of the risk potential, higher interest rate, the risks, the political risk of pressuring, using Washington to pressure the government. like so many times with Argentina and Brazil and South American countries. If you had a choice, as this particular central banker said in our meeting, if you had a choice of choosing between borrowing money from the bankers of Wall Street or the Chinese State Development Bank, there's no comparison.
And don't forget the dogfight in domestic politics of the United States. President Trump is so unhappy about the latest hike in interest rate to such a degree where he wants to fire the chairperson of the Federal Reserve. And the same is true with the Democrats as opposed to Republicans after the midterm congressional elections.
I think part of the problem with the discussion about debt, trade, many of these very real economic issues and economic competition taking place is exactly that the narrative is not really being shaped by the people who really kind of matter, and this is really the case with the debt trap. If we go back to actually, let's look at the African continent, the estimates of the needs for infrastructure finance, for external support for infrastructure finance. You know, of course, African countries, like all other countries, can raise their own taxes. They can try and make sure that they're providing infrastructure for their citizens themselves, but they won't be able, for various reasons, their economies are constrained. They're not growing fast enough.
To conclude our brainstorming session of this part, very quickly, can I have feedback from Victor and Rick?
I'll be very quick. Those who accuse China of laying the death trap is really barking on the wrong tree, probably deliberately. Equity financing and debt financing are just normal financing products. Those who are unhappy with the Chinese debt financing probably should come up with debt financing on their own. And I think the Chinese companies and the Chinese government will be very happy, whoever who can come up with the debt financing. But don't accuse China of debt financing while you cannot come up with any financing, equity or debt.
It is reported that President Trump will raise $60 billion as subsidy for American companies who are ready to invest in developing countries.
Yeah. I mean, I believe debt is an issue, and I don't think we should just dismiss it as a conspiracy. But it's more complicated than just that. Nations throughout the last 50 years have taken loans that they haven't paid back, whether it's South America, Africa, Asia, Latin America. And so it's legitimate to ask about that. Is this a smart economic decision that's going on? But at the same time, I agree completely that a lot of these countries would rather have the conditions of China, where, number one, they don't have to worry about the corruption that they would have to, the corruption problems that they would have to have in dealing with the World Bank, say. And the second is the bankers. Dealing with Wall Street bankers is something that they don't want to deal with. They'd rather, if they have a problem with a debt, deal with Chinese state banks than dealing with Wall Street.
What we need to be concerned about is what is the debt going into, and is it good enough? Is the debt at the lowest interest rates possible, and is it going into the most productive activities?
With that, we conclude this very enlightening brainstorming session as to whether China is open enough in this process of globalization or the other way around. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.